Hello, have you thought at all about your food security? Well, perhaps not in a place like Australia, a land blessed with productivity and abundance. But food security is a genuine challenge, and perhaps it's a lot closer than you might think. My name's Genevieve Jacobs. We're at the National Library. I acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of this place, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and commit myself to ongoing acts of reconciliation. Outside the walls of the National Library, we're in the midst of Enlighten, and that means that every night the library is festooned with fruit and with flowers. It's a veritable cornucopia of living delights. This year is the United Nations International Year of Fruit and Vegetables, and the library is working to stimulate the audio and visual senses of our visitors. Which brings me to our event today. With me is Professor Bob Furbank. He's from the ANU's ARC Centre of Excellence for Translational Photosynthesis, and we'll be talking about an issue that is a lot closer to home than you might think, and that is food security. Bob's internationally known for his research into aspects of photosynthesis and carbon allocation transport in crop plants, and understanding and manipulating C4 photosynthesis. Now that sounds like a mouthful, but bear with us because it's got profound connections for the way that we grow our food and the issues that we've got to face here in Australia, but also globally at a time when food security is becoming precarious for many, many people, including our near neighbours and perhaps even ourselves. Bob, hello, good to have you here.
Hi Genevieve, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, apart from the extensive science background, you're actually also a vigneron, aren't you? I mean, this is a classic Canberra combination of the scientist and the wine grower.
Yes, the Canberra wine industry was established by CSIRO scientists, in fact, so yeah, there's a bit of a pedigree there.
There is indeed. You're walking in some fairly significant footsteps.
Indeed.
How do you define food security? If we use that phrase, what do you think it means?
Yeah, well, it means different things to different people. Many people think it means making sure that farmers in sub-Saharan Africa can sustain themselves, but it's much more than that. It's about making sure that our supply and demand functions are balanced globally in producing enough nutritious food to feed a burgeoning population.
And supply and demand, which we'll get to in a moment, is the real key here, because we may well be able to supply, whether we can meet the demand, whether those two things sit in balance are really the crux of this issue. But we are in a blessed country here in Australia. We're in this very productive place where we do agriculture very, very well. Why do we need to be talking about it?
Well, for Australia, agribusiness is a very important part of our economy. So from an economics point of view, it's an important research area to make sure that our farmers have the best possible opportunities to maximise their profit and to produce food in a sustainable way. But because Australia is such a major food exporter, we play a large role in producing food for the rest of the world. So making sure that we can do that effectively and consistently is extremely important for food security.
And in fact, as you've touched on there, Australia does export quite a lot of food, and we supply ourselves very substantially with food. We're relatively unusual in that. If you look at European nations, for example, we are well able to provide for ourselves by contrast with many others in the West.
Indeed. Our population base, I guess, given our land area, is quite small, but you know, we've seen how supply chains can fail during the COVID crisis, for example. So there are issues around food security and supply and demand in a regional perspective as well as an international one that are important as well.
Yeah, and again, we'll touch on this later, but one of the things I certainly noticed during the terrible black summer of bushfires and during that awful crisis down the south coast was the fact that food supply was interrupted only for a day or two, but it was a prescient reminder that even in a place as blessed and productive as we are, you could actually have empty shelves in the supermarkets.
Indeed.
You could have a genuine lack of food, which was a shock to people.
Yes, and a little later we'll perhaps get on to that topic of if we only have to go back a decade, and we saw that happen for reasons of an imbalance in the supply and demand function in global food production rather than just regional.
Bob, run through the size of the global food security problem for me and talk to me about where the needs will arise.
Yeah, well, it's, I guess to put it in perspective, everyone focuses on the year 2050 when the global population is expected to reach 10 billion people. The challenge there is that we have to produce 70% more food to feed that many people on less land, because global warming is causing a reduction in our productivity, agricultural productivity worldwide. There's less land on which to grow food. So we're trying to grow more on less from less. And a few years back, the chief executive of CSIRO did a small study with some of her economics people, and she said that in the next 20 years we'll have to produce more food than we've consumed in the whole history of mankind. So that kind of puts it in perspective. That's a lot of food.
I mean, that's a frightening prospect. And of course, we think about our near neighbours where the population density is enormous, and places like Indonesia can be very, very highly productive. But this is a regional problem for us as well as a global problem, isn't it?
Indeed, and I do some work with the Gates Foundation on rice productivity, and I've worked with the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. And the Director General of IRRI told me that 70% of the poorest people in the world, in fact, live in Southeast Asia, so right on our doorstep. And most of the global rice production is consumed in that area as well. So the issues of potential famine under conditions where we can't supply enough food are right on our doorstep.
What about us? Our population is growing and growing reasonably rapidly. Where will we be positioned in terms of our own food security by 2050?
Well, in terms of our own food security, I guess the only risk for us in Australia is that the very best produce gets exported and we're left with what's remaining. But the National Farmers Federation have done a study looking at the projections of the burgeoning Australian export of agricultural products versus our local consumption. And they're convinced that there won't be any immediate problems locally in terms of food security. But for niche products and for certain products which are in high international demand, then we may not have the bounteous choice that we currently have.
What about climate change? What sort of impact are the questions around a variable climate and particularly water availability likely to have on Australian production?
A great impact. A colleague of mine at the ANU, Mark Howden, leads the Climate Change Institute, and he's part of the International Panel on Climate Change. And the modelling now is becoming quite granular, and we can look at geographical areas and predict what will happen in much more detail than we were in the past. So the challenges for Australia, for instance, will be great. Most of our temperate areas where we grow our cereal crops will be deleteriously affected by reduction in rainfall and an increase in average temperature. And we've seen it happen already in Western Australia. Parts of the West Australian wheat belt are no longer productive. Farmers can't rely on producing perhaps one crop every 3 years, which is enough to pay off their overdraft. So I think what we'll see in Australia is a remapping of where things are grown. And for us to reach a $100 billion per annum industry, which is what we're aiming at in our agribusiness systems, will be a great challenge given the issues of climate change and climate variability, as you say. A poor season 1 year. Well, this year's been an excellent season. Everyone thinks, well, the drought's over, we don't need to worry. But who knows what will El Nino bring us if it comes back next year.
And certainly the reliability that we in the cropping zones used to have for our produce, and I'm from a farming family myself, my husband and brother are both farmers, and the shift in the seasons, the uncertainty about really unseasonably heavy rain, for example, can actually be a problem. I mean, Australian farmers are pretty good. Australian farmers are among the most efficient in the world, and that's a consequence of lots of different factors. Apart from anything, it's not having the kinds of tariffs and economic arrangements that lots of other nations have. And so we've had to just get really, really good at what we do. Aren't we already growing wheat and rice and those staples very well here?
Well, we are, considering that we're one of the least subsidised agricultural industries in the world. And in fact, I went to a Crawford conference a few years ago where an African researcher said to me, well, we look to you guys in Australia for new technologies for growing crops in arid lands because you grow your crops in some of the worst conditions globally, you know, thinking of the deep sands of Western Australia. And indeed, you look at a crop in Britain and Europe of wheat, it looks like you could walk on it. And you go to Western Australia and look at the deep sands in the wheat belt, and you could walk through the wheat rather than walk on it. So yes, we do an extremely good job, but the challenges that we're now facing are pushing crop breeding right to the limits. We're reaching an asymptote in our capacity to improve yield further, which is why we need some new technologies.
Okay, so it's a big problem. It's coming at us. Efficient and effective as we are in this country, that won't necessarily protect us from the effects of the challenges that are going to be facing us regionally and globally. Explain to me then photosynthetic efficiency and why you think that this maybe is one of the answers to the challenges we've got in front of us.
Sure. Well, if we look at, it's always instructive to go back and look at a bit of history when we're looking at how we can move forward in things like crop breeding. The greatest advance in yield of cereal crops occurred in the 1960s with the Green Revolution, and that the improvements there of 50 to 60% improvements in yield in one sort of quantum step change through the work of Nobel Prize winning wheat breeder Norman Borlaug, for example, and similar advances were made in rice. These advances were mainly about improving the way that the crop put the products of photosynthesis into yield. So one of the major advances in yield in wheat and rice were the dwarfing genes, which made the crop smaller. The wheat and rice crops of today compared with the crops we were growing in the early part of the 1900s. In the 1900s, the crops were taller than I am. Now they barely come up to my knees. And the consequence of that is that the plant puts more carbon that it takes from the atmosphere and puts it into grain and less into the stems and leaves. But we've now reached the maximum capacity to leverage off that advance. And if we reduce the amount of straw or leaves on a wheat crop now, we get to the point where we're reducing the solar panels. We can't use enough light to fix the carbon dioxide we need to fill the grain. So since the late 1990s in rice and in the last decade or so in wheat, we've recognised that we need to look elsewhere for yield gains, and photosynthesis, the efficiency with which plants can photosynthesise, has become the new yield target for breeders.
So let's talk about how you'll get there, and I think even for those of us with a non-scientific background, you can grasp that basic idea that photosynthesis is that fundamental life process, and that if we can maximise and indeed supercharge that then really boosts the yields that are available. And we're talking still at this stage about broad-scale agriculture. What you're talking about, though, essentially is gene splicing, isn't it?
Yeah, partly. There are two approaches that we've been using. One of those approaches, which I call the Plant Olympics, is looking at, we've had domesticated crops for 2,000 years, so many people now are accumulating seed banks of different wheats that have been, some of which haven't been grown for maybe hundreds of years. The same has been happening with all of our food crops. And in these seed banks there's a huge amount of what we call genetic diversity. So what we can do now with some of our new digital agriculture tools is go out and measure the attributes of those crops, look at the genes that underpin that, and then breed with those in our breeding programs. So that's a more traditional approach. The less traditional approach is to look at those best performing plants, which are the genes responsible, and use gene editing in our modern wheat varieties to duplicate or copy what those wheat varieties, for instance, were doing, without bringing in all of the detrimental characters in those old wheats, which we'd normally try and cross into our new ones. You get poor quality in the grain, you get disease, you don't have disease tolerance, you have tall plants instead of short plants. So you can now virtually short circuit years of breeding. What might take 20 years to breed a new wheat, theoretically you might be able to bring down to 4 or 5 years. And we don't have a lot of time to do all this, so we need to be using technologies that we can deploy quickly, because at the moment it takes 7 to 10 years to make a new wheat variety and bring it on the market.
So if we shorten that process, if we move past the old school method of breeding, crossing, hoping, germinating, assessing, going on with the next generation, are you able to do very precise gene splicing? Tell me what you would look at trying to achieve in that process to maximise photosynthesis.
For photosynthesis. So we can use the approach of understanding the process. So it's interesting, Australia has really punched way above its weight in photosynthesis research since the 1960s. Australia has really led the way on understanding the biochemistry and biophysics of photosynthesis in more of a basic research context. So even to the point where a whole pathway of photosynthesis was discovered right here in Australia back in the 1960s. So we know so much about photosynthesis that we can go into individual steps and manipulate them. So for instance, the enzyme that's responsible for absorbing carbon dioxide from the air in rice and wheat is called rubisco. Rubisco, we know, is a very inefficient catalyst, so we can go in and tweak rubisco. We can look for better rubiscos and put them into our crops and improve photosynthesis. So that's one way we can do it. Or we can take attributes from other plants. For instance, you mentioned C4 plants. That photosynthetic pathway was discovered right here in Australia by Hatch and Slack. That's a supercharger or a turbocharging mechanism where plants like sorghum, maize, sugarcane that grow incredibly fast, they can photosynthesize 30 or 40% faster than wheat or rice. So we can use that as a model, if you like. Evolution's produced these plants. Can we make rice or wheat behave like that and turbocharge photosynthesis by taking genes from maize, for example, putting them into rice? Is what we're doing with one of our Gates Foundation funded projects.
So let's just unpack this for a moment, because anyone who's ever grown corn will know that corn in your vegetable garden with plenty of sunlight and water just absolutely roars up, grows like the clappers, huge leaves, massive capacity to photosynthesize you would deduce from that. But you're talking about taking genes from something like maize, you mentioned sorghum, other species, and splicing it into whole other species. So this isn't about taking pre-existing genetic capacity from wheat crops or from rice crops. It's about lifting it out of something completely different and putting it into that plant that we want to crop with.
And it's quite new that we're able to do this. Back in 2009, when we were first funded by the Gates Foundation to make C4 rice, turbocharge rice photosynthesis, we had to put in one gene at a time into rice, and we still had to do the old-fashioned crossing. So we started out, we'd put one gene from maize, another one, and then we'd have to cross them together. So it's a very slow process. Now with synthetic biology, we're putting 10 or 12 genes in at the one time. So within 6 months you have something that you can test. In synthetic biology, it takes its cues from engineering. You test, prototype, redesign. So it's really revolutionising the way we do things. So gene editing and synthetic biology go hand in hand. But then a general nervousness about new technologies and whether GM foods, for example, are a good thing. I always look back on some of the most transformative things that have happened in traditional crop breeding. Bread wheat comes from wide crosses between 3 different grasses, one of which looks like it should be growing in your lawn. And that's the grass that brings in all of the dough-making qualities to wheat. Those grasses would never normally have any kind of sexual relationship with each other. They had to be introduced and compelled to do that. And it wasn't GM, but it's awfully close. A lot of the resistance genes that have been brought into wheat for rust, because people know about farro and rust-resistant wheat's very important for Australian agriculture. Many of those came from rye, which is a completely different species. And whole bits of rye chromosome are in wheat now, which give it stem rust resistance. But it's not very precise, so you'll carry things in that aren't beneficial like coloured flour. So the original stem rust genes had coloured flour come along with that bit of the Y chromosome. So what we can do now with editing and with synthetic biology is to put just the genes that we want in there. And they don't have to be bacterial genes or fish genes, or they can be genes from other wheats, or they can be genes from maize or sorghum, and it's a much more precise way of doing things.
Well, moratoriums on GM crops are being lifted around Australia, and we've had fairly long-running moratoriums responding to the level of public concern there's been about gene technology. I mean, my bet would be, Bob, that you haven't necessarily won the hearts and minds of people on the safety of this. You mentioned that yourself. How do you respond to those concerns about the food chain, even when, as you say, this is much more precise, it's much more refined, we're not crashing into plants between species, but there's still anxiety about this, isn't there?
Yeah, and I guess my answer to that is any new technology which is unproven in terms of its safety, despite the very, very strict regulations we have in place in this country around GM food and GM technology, people are understandably nervous about it. And I think that labelling and extensive explanation of what, I mean, one of the problems I think we have with GM food is the conflation of GM with big business, you know, Monsanto, evil Monsanto, all this stuff, and the domination of our early crop traits with agrochemical-based solutions. So what we're seeing now are products which come from GM technology which have a health benefit, which have a benefit to third world nutrition or even to our nutrition, like the omega-3 canola that's been made by CSIRO, which is now being grown. I use examples like BT cotton. Cotton has a natural resistance to one of the bollworms through a protein that comes from a bacterium, BT. 90% of Australian cotton has that in it, and it's reduced pesticide use by more than 60%. So there are obvious benefits, and the safety really is a time thing. I think 18 to 20 years without any negative health implications, to me, you know, we're getting close to having a solid argument for the safety issues.
Yeah, I think you've drawn a really interesting comparison there, because certainly, as you say, a lot of the associations are with things like Roundup Ready canola, the kinds of things that are allied to chemical giants, and people do feel very uneasy about this. And what you're talking about is using photosynthetic efficiency on major cereals for really big gains in productivity. Now, I think we can probably all see that there are huge advantages there, but I wonder also about biodiversity, because this will be such an appealing crop for farmers, and monocropping's not necessarily a good thing either, but I would think the temptation for wheat and rice growers to be able to breed crops that are so much more productive, that require less fertilisers and less pesticides, will inevitably lead to a bit of monoculture, won't it?
Yes, well, this is a real issue, because in the Australian environment, large farms are the most efficient farms, and we've seen that a general decline in family farms and the expansion of corporatised farming simply because the input costs are lower. But I think that as we remap where we grow our crops, we need to think about what other things we can grow, and I think there'll become an opportunity to look at other farming systems that are more suitable to our environment. So I like to see more exploration of native foods, of Australian native plants, and whether their potential for domestication, particularly on areas that are not suitable for broadacre agriculture. So, you know, the question comes up, if we move in Western Australia a proportion of the wheat belt down to the coast around Albany, for example, because it's higher rainfall, what do we do with the rest? You know, we've got rural communities, we've got soils that need stabilisation. So we really have to start looking at the agronomy and the agricultural practices to see what else we can be doing alongside developing the most resilient and capable germplasm we can give to farmers. I'll
I'll draw you back just again to the biodiversity. I went to Iran recently, where they grow beautiful wheat crops on their high plateaus, and of varieties that are not so-called improved varieties, but much more diverse. So they're looking at dozens and dozens and dozens of different varieties of wheat, just for example. And obviously there's a great reservoir of germplasm there. The qualities that are in those unimproved varieties can be really significant for the future, can't they?
Absolutely, and it's interesting you should say that, because we're lagging a little bit behind in Australia in this aspect, but there are laboratories in Europe. There's a group in Germany, for example, that have a germplasm collection of thousands of years of diversity of wheat, barley and wheat relatives. And they have a gene sequencing machine, or a number of them, running day and night, getting the gene sequences of all of those ancient crops, and they're growing them out and looking at how they perform. So once again, we can deploy that into our modern varieties with gene editing. But of course, this issue of monoculture is quite interesting too, because if you look at what's happening in Canada and parts of the US, the way that they're moving now with high technology and precision agriculture is, whereas in Australia we might have 1,500, maybe 5,000 hectares of one wheat variety. Now with robotic tractors and GPS, you can sow almost a patchwork of different wheat varieties on your farm, so that if you get a frost, for example, oh, well, that one was flowering at the time the frost came, that one's gone, but I've got all the other ones. So we can now technologically cope with more of a diverse cropping system, and I think you're right, that's the way things will probably go.
I mean, I think we need to interrogate this stuff. You mentioned the Green Revolution of the 1960s, Norman Borlaug's work, and he won the Nobel Prize for saving 1 billion people from hunger. But we know that at the same time, cropping moved into increasingly fragile areas. Now, that's got to be a temptation too with what you're describing. Water tables were polluted, fertiliser runoff has been a disaster. Gene splicing won't have those specific effects, but are you concerned about where this might potentially lead in environmental terms, and perhaps particularly with reference to fragile areas and areas where people are just tempted to push the barrow because maybe there'll be $1 in it? And that's what we saw happening in Africa in the 60s.
Certainly, and I think that is one of the major challenges, that we have to be able to grow more on less land from less inputs with the vagaries of the climate, extreme weather events, and how we do that is still a matter of conjecture. What I can do as a plant biologist is to provide the crop breeders with strategies to produce the best possible germplasm and the most resilient germplasm, so that farmers can have some kind of security from one year to the next. I think there are opportunities with biotechnology to address the sustainability issues that you're talking about. So let's take an example. C4 rice, if we were successful at doing that, C4 rice would have 50% increase in nitrogen use efficiency, so you use less nitrogen fertiliser. It would have around 50% increase in water use efficiency. So there's a way that biotechnology could improve the sustainability of the crop as well as improve the yield. So we'd be getting a bit more bang for our buck. There's also opportunities with what I call programmable plants, where we now have the synthetic biology tools where we could grow a wheat crop, for example, and you'll appreciate this with your background, and the farmer would be able to look at his expert system and say, well, this is what the weather's looking like. I've done my soil moisture test. I reckon I'm not going to be able to get through to the end of the season and do prime hard wheat. I'd like to switch my crop into an oil producer and make oil in the leaves, and then I'm going to harvest it all, bale it and sell it to the racehorse industry, and I'll make nearly as much money as I would from hard-prime wheat. It sounds like science fiction. It's all doable now.
It's very tempting. It's very tempting.
Yeah. So what I like about that is that it empowers the farmer. You know what it's like. My wife comes from a wheat farm in Western Australia, and she said, oh yeah, the bank manager would come and sit at the dining table with Dad and say, well, how are we going to give you enough overdraft so you can sow your next crop? If you could sit down with your model and say, well, this is what I reckon the weather's going to do. If worst comes to worst, then I'm going to switch it into this. you've got somewhere to go forward with. You've got a resilient community as well as a resilient crop. So I am, in fact, quite optimistic about the future and the possible for technological solutions, but the sociological and the ecological challenges are manifest, and we certainly need to try and address those at the same time.
Well, just again on that question of sustainability, a lot of the conversation we've had for this last half hour or so has been about fairly large-scale cropping operations, the kind of agriculture that we do on broad scale here in Australia. The alternative to that, surely, is empowering much more small-scale agriculture to meet the food security challenges and fold that into the access problems that are likely to be caused by extreme weather, for example. Aren't we better off working really hard on heightening levels of local food production, perhaps even on very small scales, as a first priority?
Well, I don't know about first priority, but what you find in people who are looking at approaching the food security issues, you've got two camps. You've got your broadacre farmers, and then you've got your vertical farmers, urban agriculture folk, protected horticulture. And they generally spend all of their time throwing rocks at each other. But really, a distributed solution is going to be the answer. For our large calorie-producing crops, like wheat and rice, for example, I think broadacre has to be the way to go. But for our smaller volume, nutritious crops, where we need to be able, in third world agriculture, produce a mixed diet which is going to work for the farmer, and also around major population centres where vertical farming can produce our salad vegetables. We've got protected horticulture producing high quality fruit crops, for example. There are real advantages to that supply chain of supply and consume locally and reduce the carbon footprint, for example. So we need a distributed solution, and we need to stop throwing rocks at each other and work together to make something that's fit for purpose.
And look, I think you're absolutely right that there tends to be this chasm between the broad-scale people on one side and the small-scale producers on the other. And in fact, we need to work out how we can be part of one functioning and effective and distributed solution to the kinds of problems you've been describing. You've been talking very much in terms of science, but I wonder, as we discuss this, isn't this also a political and a social problem as much as anything? I mean, don't we need to focus on better distribution and food equity, as well as looking at what we can do with every kind of exciting science fiction technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I met Norman Borlaug when he came to Australia many years ago, and he gave a talk about this. And of course, someone asked that question, well, wouldn't you be better off just improving the roads in sub-Saharan Africa to get food around? And his kind of answer was, well, as a crop breeder, I'm trying to have the maximum impact with my skill set, and I can't go in and change the birth rate, and I can't go in and build roads in sub-Saharan Africa. But once again, all of those things need to be done. And I think if you look at the way the Gates Foundation invests its money, they invest in high tech. They've invested a couple of $100 million now in photosynthetic improvement, for example, in rice, in cowpea and cassava. But they also invest in social programs, so improving the lot of women in sub-Saharan Africa, improving infrastructure. So yeah, a distributed solution again is definitely the way to go. And I guess my focus has been what I can do as a plant biologist and crop physiologist.
But just before we perhaps come to the end of this, I'd love you to tell me about what happened the last time the world had a real food security issue. And surprisingly, to many people who'll be watching this, not very long ago at all, about a decade ago. That's
right, Genevieve. It's interesting. I think we almost do ourselves a disservice by focusing on 2050. I mean, some of my friends say to me, and people at Celador, my winery, say, 2050, that's years away. You boffins will have sorted it out by then. And so there's this expectation that everything's going to sort itself out. But I take them on a bit of a journey back to 2008. And this was a period where we had a long history of producing more food, particularly more grain than we needed. 10 years before that, I was sitting with colleagues in Britain, and we were pulling our hair out saying, well, there's a grain mountain The EU's paying people not to grow crops, to go into fallow. How can we ever get research going for yield? But in 2008, we'd consumed more rice in the previous 2 years than we'd produced. The Thais decided they didn't have enough rice to meet local demand, so they decided they weren't going to export any. Rice prices went through the roof, from $300 a tonne to $700 a tonne, just in the space of a few months. We had a bad season in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere for wheat production 2 years in a row. Suddenly the global wheat reserves went to 30 days of consumption. So here we were suddenly with this teeter-totter of supply and demand, where there wasn't even rice on the shelves in Tesco in Oxford. So, this is like our bushfire crisis, but on a global scale. So a lot of third world farmers, they're not subsistence. They grow a crop, they sell their crop, and then they buy back food later in the year, particularly the commodity growers. So it was disastrous for them. They couldn't afford to live. So that was an example of what can happen with food security when that supply-demand function gets out of kilter. Also at that time, there were food riots in Cairo and there was the beginning of Arab Spring. So suddenly politicians began to see security wasn't just food security, it was global security, it was a social issue, it was a defence issue. That can happen again and will happen again, I think, particularly with the impact of climate change and extreme weather events.
Yeah, I think it's a very sobering observation to end on, the fact that tumultuous political change can come out of factors that are connected with how secure our food supply is, and perhaps in ways that are much closer to home than we might expect. Bob, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Professor Bob Furbank from the ANU's ARC Centre of Excellence for Translational Photosynthesis, which you've explained very well, and I thank you for that. And let's see what the next couple of decades bring in terms of the climate challenges that we face here in Australia, the political challenges for the wider region. It's a tense and difficult time in many ways as we see what happens with the planet. But I'm going to let you get back to your grapes. Thank you so much for your time,
Genevieve.
Bob. Thank you. Bye-bye.